Welcome, Brad.
Thank you. And happy spring, everybody. I hear a very anxious cardinal chirping outside my window, and this has been a glorious weekend to begin this wonderful season and the promise of new life that it holds. Let us embrace that as we raise the veil and venture into the final frontier of consciousness. I wanted to first thank you all for having me back to speak. I'm very grateful for and humbled by this opportunity and this community. It is in communities like this that each of us navigates our states of being and our quest to align ourselves more closely with the transformations of self into wholeness through listening to, as Ernest Holmes said, the whisperings of divine intuition. And I thank you, Gregory, for that perfect setup with Holmes's very own words. In my subjective consciousness, I avoided speaking for years, but then I was asked, urged, pushed a little by my dear friend Kareem Bel-Jalali, as whom you all know very well, and my higher consciousness, my spirit, which I was trained well to listen to by One Spirit Learning Alliance, gave me that little shove to say yes. And I said yes, and I understood that the rest would find its way. That was about a year and a half ago. And now that I think of it, Kareem has been a catalyst for several yeses that have pushed me into greater service to spirit and thus more steady connection to it within me. He was assigned to me to be his mentor in seminary. I said yes. And that is how we first came to know each other. He then later asked me, convinced me, cajoled me to join the board of One Spirit when he was president. And 3 years later, he asked me to succeed him as president. Each time I looked at him like that dog when you give them a tantalizing word and they cock their heads like, what? And I said, and each time I landed on yes. I'm grateful beyond words for his and all other nudges in my life that have offered me a path. It is that yes to spirit, to that whispering divine voice, which is, as Ernest Holmes said, nothing less than God in humans. He says man, but we're in a new consciousness now. I woke up yesterday morning very early to work on my talk for today, and I hit my Instagram to find, oh, wait a minute, I was supposed to have this ready. This image. Can you see it? It's two brains. It says two rival theories of consciousness are now being put to the test. I laughed, but it was a poignant reminder of how far we've come and yet how far we have to go. Science may be discovering a process, a sense of where the consciousness is physically measured in the brain, but it can never explain what it truly is in words. No one can. Albert Einstein said this: the most beautiful and profound emotion we can experience is the sensation of the mystical. It is at the root of all true science, that deeply emotional conviction of the presence of a superior reasoning power, which is revealed in the incomprehensible universe, is my idea of God. I have to say, it is mine as well. The reason I titled this talk, The Final Frontier, is not just a cute nod to Star Trek. I've been thinking about the past year and the event that launched us all at warp speed through a wormhole into a new reality, one that came with a lot of fear and uncertainty, pain and loss, but also with a heightened sense of things that have converged in the world to invite us to wake up, to shake up, to bake a new cake up, because that old recipe is not working anymore. It invited us to dig deeper into our subjective individual and collective race consciousness, as Holmes calls it, and to tap more deeply into our cosmic consciousness, that still small voice within us that is the connective thread that links us to everything in the entire universe, but most tangibly to ourselves and our fellow humans, and to all sentient and non-sentient beings of this planet and beyond, to our planet itself. That consciousness is beyond words and thought, like love. It's that feeling we get when standing before the ocean watching the sunset, impossible to fully describe, but profoundly felt. And the more we can give ourselves to that feeling, that sense of contact, the deeper we permeate a connection to all things and even slip into that infinite space beyond our comprehension. We also feel this when we allow ourselves to truly and fully love. And it's also the feeling we get when suffering immense loss and grief. And fully taking that journey is to fully step into our wholeness. So wonderful. That's all very grand. It's huge. So how does it play out in our more subjective lives here on planet Earth in these bodies at this time? We've had two brilliant speakers already this month on consciousness, Mark and Becca, who offered up great thoughts on how we can move in this terrain. All I can do is add to what they have offered, and countless others have as well, in my reflection on what we already actually know. We know it in our hearts, we know it in our minds, but most importantly, we know it in our beings. Not just our bodies, but our luminous divine beings of cosmic consciousness. As I moved through this past year in this altered state of being along with everyone else, I became acutely aware of my place and purpose. I was blessed with the ability to move out of the city and live in Sag Harbor. I set up my workspace in front of this big window behind me that looked out on a large green that spills into wetlands in a cove facing west. It offers the most amazing sunsets. I watched the hint of buds and trees turn to fat buds and leaves and flowers, and I watched those branches move in breezes and strong winds and shift as they filled into the burgeoning of the season and tempered back down for the rest of winter. I came to know their rhythms. I reveled in their dance. This year's buds are now just emerging. I watched the wildlife around me, the winds, the rain, the clouds dancing on the painting the sky, and in the clearings to the stars and planets, and imagined the beyond. I gained a deeper sense of the idea that consciousness permeates literally every infinitesimal element of the universe, that it was a spark of consciousness that ignited the creative burst of the universe, and from there became everything that exists, became this world, became us, is God as us and in us. The idea that literally everything in the universe contains consciousness is a profoundly deep journey to take and a beautiful one to consider. But then again, is any of this really a surprise? We all have it within us. As many have, I'm sure, in my own way, I also became acutely aware of the workings of my subjective consciousness and our collective consciousness. We're going through a cycle of change, and that change is fraught with both incredulous pain and division, but also incredible promise and hope. And as the year went on and the events unfolded, I consciously questioned every assumption I had, every belief, every action to try to bring myself to greater connection to cosmic consciousness, divine mind, and let that inform my daily life and being. Because as much as I could look at others and systems and communities and examine and critique and point my fingers, I know that the real action begins with me. Loss has loomed large on our horizons, loss of life, of resources, and the grieving of same. And our ability to deal with grief and loss is challenged at every turn. We've also lost a sense of place with all that has been revealed to us this year in ways that we've not heard quite the same way as before. We've witnessed the culmination of years of division and polarization in our politics and our communities, even within our families and friends. We've seen the horrors we inflict on each other play out in our isolation. Technology has infiltrated our lives, and high-tech manipulations have infused our brains. We barely know who or what to trust anymore, sometimes including even ourselves. In short, we've been laid bare. And we can lay down and we can let it run roughshod over us, or we can listen, and go deeper, deeper, and yet deeper into that vast frontier of consciousness. And in whatever small way, we can begin the march toward an evolutionary leap in human awareness and action. Nothing short of that may be an option anymore. It is clear as a bell that we don't any longer have the luxury of indulging in that tried and true definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. The series of cycles throughout the world's existence is especially affected since the emergence and domination of the human race, because we have the power to alter the world in profound and, as we've discovered, destructive ways. And we can wax on about the human condition and how we will get through this. But the key difference now in this cycle, the reason I think of this as a kind of final frontier, is that we've reached a point in our development and our abilities where we have the means to actually do such destruction, or should I say further destruction, to the planet, as to effectively annihilate ourselves and take a whole lot with us. We are at a tipping point, a precipice, a crossroads, and it's not just regional, it is global. But we also have the knowledge, the consciousness to fix it, to evolve. And that, to me, has been what has come to sit at the table for this last year, to sit at the table and command an audience. I mean, we've always had that knowledge, we've always had the tools and the wherewithal to do this, but we remain our own worst enemy. Therein lies the human paradox, but also therein lies the promise. We are being called to that promise like never before. We may or may not make it, but we can live it no matter what. And that is the conclusion I settled into more deeply, looking out my window this year, being in spaces like this one, being in communities of people, doing the good, hard work of change, and realizing in many ways, it is the youngest among us who have the greatest wisdom at this moment. They are baffled by what the world has become, by what their elders have left them, and I don't blame them. We see countless ways our behavior has challenged our Mother Earth, and at our core, we know that what we must do. We just have not mastered the collective consciousness to manifest it enough to steer clear of that iceberg. Greta Thunberg, a great young woman who crossed the sea to give us a message, says, the climate crisis has already been solved. We already have the facts and the solutions. All we have to do is wake up and change. She's right. When I look out my window now, when I look at every living thing around me, I try to pause and consider that it is my responsibility to manifest energetically and through whatever action I can to make this environment a place we can both survive and thrive in. So the next time you look out your window or encounter the living world around you in small and great ways, take a pause to think how you can be permeable in that reality and not separate from it as we have been trained. Look into the eyes of an animal, yours or some other, and dive as deep as you can into their essential being. Do the same with a tree, with a flower, an insect, etc. Look at how you eat, shop, and consume. Consider the information that 75% of our recycled plastic is now strewn over the streets of countries far off in the East because it really isn't that recyclable. We have witnessed the continued horrors of racism play out in front of us in ways that are certainly not new, but have been thrust in front of us now in ways we cannot avoid. From the murder of George Floyd to this most recent and painful slaughter in Atlanta, and the reality of yet another look at the legacy of othering of one people to falsely elevate another. As many of us have just begun to learn the legacy of slavery and racism in this country, we are now confronted with how that has affected Asian people. More to learn, more to fix. We have vast amounts of knowledge and understanding to learn about this and change it. And once you start learning about its history and legacy, you can't help but be moved to action. And we must move toward that perfect union as we in this collective United States aspire to. It need not be a burden, but it is work. It's good and necessary work. If we search our deepest consciousness, can anyone truly say that we are not all the same race, one human race? And when we see and act on that, we are all elevated to our highest. Think about those moments when through language or action, someone does violence to another, to a group, and how that manifests itself in the world. I think about this more and more within myself. Peeling away the trauma of internalized biases is the work presented to us now. How does that move through you? What is worth holding on to? How do you let it go? And what are we really afraid of? One way this has affected me deeply in the past year is dealing with the political landscape and the deep pain and fear I have felt for years. It's also manifest in the rage and hatred of certain beliefs and thinking. When the election happened and I was confronted with the reality that 73 million people, my fellow citizens, voted for something that was anathema to me, I immediately wanted to shut them out and shut them down. But I looked deeper at my core and I realized these were people with hopes and fears and people who were responding to their subjective and collective consciousnesses as I was. And I knew that fundamentally I had to implore the principle of seeing the face of God in everyone I encounter. From there, all else can fall into place. Doesn't mean we won't argue, debate, disagree, and maybe have to keep our distance, but it doesn't mean we have to hate or destroy someone, and it doesn't mean that we can't live side by side. Yes, there are extremes. We saw that play out on January 6th in DC, but all that can be tempered if we listen to our better angels and not those who urge us to hate each other. So where do we go with this? How do we reach that much deeper into the infinite frontier within ourselves to take a truly deep leap into a new reality? We can listen deeply within and without. We can take stock of how we live, how we manifest spirit in all that we do. We can start to shift our behavior and our actions in alignment with that cosmic consciousness. And we can turn that work into our greatest commitment, our greatest fulfillment, and our greatest joy, step by tiny step. As I worked more on this talk yesterday, I Googled one more time, Final Frontier, and I found a TEDx talk called Consciousness, the Final Frontier by a yogi named Dada Gunamuktananda. He spoke quite eloquently about consciousness and highlighted meditation as a very real means to connect with cosmic consciousness. We do that every week here. And he offered this at the end of his talk. This is not just an abstract concept. It's about the essence of us all. It's about discovering the greater consciousness within our own consciousness, realizing our inner reality is the greater universal reality. And the more we expand our sense of reality, our sense of being, the more connected we feel to all beings, the happier and the less lonely, the less fearful, because we realize that all is a part of us and we are a part of all. So let's get on our little Starship Enterprise and jump space and let us journey together to the final frontier. Thank you.
Thank you.